Months had passed since that fateful flight, but the ripple effects of what happened continued to shape lives, including hers. The woman's story wasn't just a flash in the pan, it became a catalyst for change, inspiring people around the world to question their own assumptions and demand better from the institutions they interacted with daily. For her, though, the journey was far from over. It wasn't enough to spark a conversation. She wanted to see lasting impact. Her days were now filled with meetings, interviews, and speaking engagements. She traveled across cities and countries, sharing her experience not as a tale of personal triumph but as a call to action. At conferences, she stood before crowds of strangers speaking candidly about the discrimination she'd faced and the importance of standing up against injustice, even when it felt like the odds were stacked against you. Her speeches weren't rehearsed or polished. They came straight from the heart, raw and honest. And every time she spoke, there was always someone in the audience who approached her afterward, tears in their eyes, saying, "Your story made me believe I can fight, too." One particularly memorable event took place at a university auditorium packed with students. After delivering her keynote address, she opened the floor to questions. A young woman raised her hand hesitantly. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. "What if I stand up for myself and nothing changes? What if no one listens?" The woman smiled warmly, stepping closer to the edge of the stage so she could look the student directly in the eye. "I get it," she said, softly. "It's terrifying to put yourself out there, especially when you don't know how people will react. But here's the thing. Even if nothing changes immediately, your voice still matters. Every time we speak up, we chip away at the walls of injustice. We plant seeds that might grow into something bigger later on. So don't stay silent, because you're afraid. It's okay to be scared. Just don't let fear stop you." The room erupted in applause, and the young woman nodded, visibly moved. Moments like these reminded her why she kept pushing forward. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about empowering others to find their voices and use them. Back home, life settled into a new rhythm. Her kids noticed the difference right away. They saw their mom on TV, heard neighbors talking about her courage, and started asking questions. "Why did those people treat you badly, Mom?" her youngest asked one evening during dinner. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Because sometimes people make judgments based on things like skin color instead of seeing who we really are," she explained gently. "But that doesn't mean we let them win. When someone tries to make you feel small, you stand tall. You show them that you're strong and worthy." Her kids absorbed this lesson quietly, their little faces serious. Over time, they began to carry themselves differently, proudly, confidently, as if they understood the weight of what their mom had done. Watching them grow into resilient, self-assured individuals gave her more strength than any award or recognition ever could. Meanwhile, Fly with Dignity continued to gain momentum. The campaign had grown beyond anything she'd envisioned, evolving into a global platform for advocacy and education. Airlines partnered with the initiative to revamp their training programs, while passengers shared stories of positive interactions with crew members who had undergone the new workshops. One passenger recounted how an attendant went out of their way to ensure she felt comfortable after noticing her anxiety during boarding. Another praised a pilot for addressing the cabin before takeoff, emphasizing respect and inclusivity for all travelers. These stories warmed her heart, proof that change was possible when people committed to doing better. Still, she remained vigilant. Progress wasn't linear, and she knew setbacks would happen. But each step forward mattered, no matter how small. Behind the scenes, she worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. Late nights became routine as she collaborated with lawyers to draft guidelines for reporting discriminatory behavior, consulted with psychologists to develop training modules focused on empathy, and strategized with activists to expand the campaign's reach. There were moments when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, but then she'd think about the countless messages she'd received from people thanking her for giving them hope, and she'd push through. One day, while scrolling through emails, she came across a letter that stopped her in her tracks. It was from a flight attendant, a Black woman, who wrote about feeling trapped in a system that often forced her to compromise her values. Before your story, I didn't think anyone cared about what happens behind the scenes. The email read. But seeing you stand up gave me the courage to report incidents I'd been ignoring for years. Thank you for showing me that my voice matters too. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read the message. This was why she kept fighting. Not for headlines or accolades, but for moments like this. For the chance to remind someone that they weren't alone, that their struggles were valid, and that together they could create change. As time went on, the woman found herself reflecting more on her own journey. She thought about the little girl she used to be, the one who dreamed big despite growing up in a world that often told her she couldn't. She thought about the challenges she'd faced as a single mother, balancing work and family while navigating systems designed to exclude her. And she thought about how far she'd come, not just professionally but personally. Standing up on that plane had been scary, yes, but it had also been liberating. It had taught her that she was stronger than she'd ever realized. Her father noticed the shift in her demeanor too. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've changed," he said simply. "Not just the world around you, but yourself." She smiled, leaning into his touch. "Maybe," she replied. "But I think it's more like I've found myself again. All those years of playing it safe, of biting my tongue to avoid rocking the boat, I forgot how powerful it feels to stand firm in who you are." He chuckled softly, pride shining in his eyes. "Well, I'm glad you remembered. And I'm proud of you, for everything." By the end of the year, the landscape of the travel industry looked markedly different. Airlines prioritized inclusivity in ways they never had before, implementing policies that protected passengers from bias and ensuring accountability when those policies were violated. Airports introduced quiet reflection spaces and cultural sensitivity training for staff. Even passengers seemed more mindful, treating each other with greater kindness and understanding. For the woman, the most rewarding part wasn't the policy, changes, or the public recognition. It was knowing she'd played a role in shifting perspectives. People were talking openly about issues they once ignored. Conversations about equality were happening at dinner tables, in classrooms, and on social media. Seeds of awareness were being planted everywhere, sprouting into ideas and actions that would continue to grow long after the spotlight faded, and yet she never lost sight of the fact that the fight wasn't over. Discrimination didn't disappear overnight, and neither did the biases that fueled it. But she believed in progress, in tiny victories adding up to monumental shifts. She believed in the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. So she kept moving forward, one step at a time. Whether it was mentoring young women, advocating for policy reform, or simply reminding someone that their voice mattered, she poured her energy into making the world a little bit better every day. Because that's what courage looked like. Not grand gestures or heroic acts, but the quiet determination to keep standing up, even when the road ahead was uncertain. In the end, her story wasn't just about reclaiming a seat on a plane. It was about reclaiming humanity. About proving that dignity isn't negotiable, no matter where you come from or what you look like. And though the journey had been hard, she wouldn't trade it for anything. After all, it wasn't just her victory. It belonged to everyone who dared to dream of a fairer, kinder world. The days following the incident felt like a whirlwind for the woman. What had started as a personal fight against discrimination quickly turned into something much bigger, a movement that resonated with people across the globe. Her video, uploaded shortly after landing in Los Angeles, spread like wildfire on social media. Within hours, it had millions of views, sparking conversations about fairness, equality, and the biases that still existed in everyday life. People from all walks of life weighed in, sharing their own experiences of being treated unfairly because of their race, gender, or background. Some recounted similar stories of being asked to give up seats, denied services, or made to feel invisible simply because of who they were. Others expressed anger, not just at the airline, but at a system that allowed such injustices to happen, without consequence. The hashtag Stand for Justice began trending worldwide, with users calling for accountability and change. For the woman, this sudden spotlight was overwhelming. On one hand, she appreciated the outpouring of support and the validation that she wasn't alone in her experience. On the other hand, she worried about becoming the face of a cause she hadn't planned to lead. She wasn't looking for fame or recognition, she just wanted what was fair. But now, with so many eyes on her, she knew she had an opportunity and a responsibility to make a difference. The airline, desperate to contain the backlash, issued multiple public statements. They apologized profusely, not only to her, but to anyone who might have experienced similar treatment. Their CEO appeared on television, promising sweeping reforms within the company. "This is not who we are," he said during an interview. "We are committed to ensuring that every passenger feels valued and respected." While some praised the airline's swift response, others weren't convinced. Skeptics pointed out that apologies were easy. Real change required action. And so the airline took drastic measures. Every employee involved in the incident, from the original flight crew to the supervisors who failed to intervene, was fired. Training programs were revamped, focusing on diversity, inclusion, and identifying unconscious bias. The airline even pledged a significant donation to organizations working to combat racial inequality. But the woman wasn't satisfied with surface-level fixes. She knew that true progress required more than firing a few employees or issuing heartfelt apologies. It meant addressing the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to occur in the first place. So, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She reached out to civil rights advocates, lawyers, and community leaders, asking for guidance on how to turn this moment into lasting change. Together, they formed a coalition aimed at tackling discrimination in the travel industry. They called it Fly with Dignity, a campaign designed to hold airlines accountable while educating passengers about their rights. Flyers could report incidents anonymously, share their stories, and access resources to help them navigate discriminatory practices. The campaign gained traction almost immediately. Airlines around the world began reaching out, eager to partner with Fly with Dignity to improve their policies. Some offered funding, while others sought advice on implementing better training programs. Even airports got involved, pledging to create safer, more inclusive spaces for travelers. The movement grew beyond anything the woman could have imagined, touching industries far beyond aviation. As part of the effort, she also launched a scholarship fund aimed at supporting young women of color pursuing careers in fields traditionally dominated by men. Growing up, she'd faced countless barriers as a black woman trying to succeed in corporate America. Now she wanted to help pave the way for future generations, ensuring they wouldn't have to face the same struggles she did. The scholarship provided financial assistance, mentorship opportunities, and networking events, all designed to empower young women to chase their dreams fearlessly. Despite the positive outcomes, the emotional toll of everything weighed heavily on her. Reliving the incident over and over again, in interviews, meetings, and public appearances, was exhausting. There were nights when she lay awake, replaying the confrontation in her mind, wondering if she could have handled it differently. Had she been too harsh? Too soft? Should she have walked away instead of standing her ground? Her father noticed the strain and pulled her aside one evening. "You're doing something incredible," he told her gently. "But you can't carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. This isn't just your fight anymore, it belongs to everyone who supports you." His words brought tears to her eyes. For the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed herself to feel vulnerable. She cried, not out of sadness, but out of relief. Relief that she wasn't alone. Relief that her voice had sparked meaningful conversations. Relief that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. Still, there were moments of doubt. Critics argued that her actions were divisive, accusing her of making a scene unnecessarily. Why didn't she just move? Some people asked online. Wouldn't it have been easier to avoid the conflict altogether? To those comments, she responded with unwavering conviction. Easier doesn't mean right, she wrote in a heartfelt post shared across social media. If I had moved, I would have been sending a message that my dignity is negotiable, that I'm willing to accept less because of the color of my skin. And I refuse to live like that, for myself, for my children, and for everyone else who deserves to be treated with respect. Her message resonated deeply with her followers. People flooded her inbox with messages of gratitude, thanking her for inspiring them to stand up for themselves too. One mother wrote about how her teenage daughter watched the news coverage and declared, "I want to be brave like her." Another man shared how hearing her story gave him the courage to file a complaint after years of enduring racist remarks at work. These stories kept her going, reminding her why she couldn't give up, even when the pressure felt unbearable. She realized that her fight wasn't just about reclaiming a seat on a plane. It was about reclaiming humanity, about reminding everyone that no matter where you come from, what you look like, or how much money you have, you deserve to be treated with dignity. By the time weeks turned into months, the initial frenzy began to die down. The headlines faded and the hashtag stopped trending, but the impact remained. Airlines implemented stricter anti-discrimination policies. Passengers became more vocal about reporting unfair treatment. Conversations about equality continued, albeit in quieter ways. Through it all, the woman stayed focused on her mission. She traveled frequently for work, always choosing first class, not because she needed to prove a point, but because she refused to let anyone dictate where she belonged. Each time she boarded a plane, she carried with her the knowledge that she had helped ignite a shift, not just in the aviation industry, but in society as a whole. And though the journey had been long and challenging, she emerged stronger, prouder, and more determined than ever. She had stood up for herself, not just for that one flight, but for every person who deserved to sit wherever they pleased, free from judgment or prejudice. By the time the plane finally took off, the energy in the cabin had shifted completely. The tension that had gripped everyone just moments earlier began to ease, replaced by a mix of curiosity and quiet admiration for the woman who had stood her ground. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding approvingly, others whispering to their seatmates about what they'd witnessed. It wasn't every day you saw someone refuse to back down when faced with such blatant unfairness. And win. The new flight crew worked efficiently, doing their best to restore a sense of normalcy after the chaos. They moved through the aisles offering drinks and snacks, their smiles warm and genuine. But even they couldn't ignore the lingering buzz of conversation among the passengers. Every now and then, one of them would glance toward the woman's seat, clearly aware that she was at the center of it all. For her part, the woman tried to relax. She leaned back into her first-class chair, letting out a slow breath as the reality of what had just happened sank in. She hadn't expected things to escalate so quickly, or end so decisively. When she thought about how close she'd come to being pushed aside, anger bubbled up again. But there was also pride. Pride in herself for refusing to be treated as less than equal. Pride in knowing she'd done the right thing no matter how uncomfortable it had been. As the hours passed, the initial shock gave way to reflection, for both the woman and the other passengers. A middle-aged man seated across the aisle leaned over at one point and said softly, "You handled that beautifully. I don't know if I could have stayed so calm." She smiled faintly, appreciating the kind words. "It wasn't easy," she admitted. "But sometimes you have to stand up for yourself, even when it feels like the whole world is against you." Her response seemed to resonate with him. He nodded thoughtfully before settling back into his seat, leaving her alone with her thoughts once more. Other passengers chimed in too, offering small gestures of support. An elderly woman handed her a handwritten note that read, "Thank you for showing us what courage looks like." A young couple traveling together gave her a thumbs up from a few rows back. Even the flight attendants, who were technically supposed to remain neutral, couldn't help but express quiet gratitude whenever they passed by. But not everyone was supportive. There were still murmurs of disapproval here and there. People who felt the disruption had been unnecessary, or that the woman should have simply moved without making a fuss. One man near the window muttered under his breath about entitlement while scrolling through his phone. Another passenger rolled her eyes dramatically when the woman walked past on her way to the restroom. These reactions stung, but they didn't surprise her. She knew not everyone would agree with her decision, but that didn't make it any less valid. When the plane landed in Los Angeles, the atmosphere was electric. Passengers gathered their belongings, eager to disembark, but many lingered just a little longer to watch the woman leave. Some clapped quietly as she stepped off the plane, while others offered nods of respect. She kept her head high, carrying herself with the same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout the ordeal. For her, this wasn't about seeking applause. It was about proving a point. About showing that standing up for yourself, even in the face of authority, could lead to real change. Once inside the terminal, she pulled out her phone and uploaded the video she'd recorded during the incident. Within minutes, it started gaining traction online. People were outraged, not just because of what had happened to her, but because it highlighted a deeper issue: the systemic racism that still permeated industries like aviation. Comments poured in from strangers around the world, praising her for her bravery and calling for accountability. The airline, meanwhile, scrambled to respond. Facing mounting public pressure, they issued a formal apology, acknowledging the unacceptable treatment the woman had endured. They promised sweeping changes to their policies and training programs, vowing to prevent similar incidents in the future. All employees involved in the situation were terminated, and the CEO personally reached out to the woman to express regret and assure her that steps were being taken to address the root causes of the problem. Despite the overwhelming support, the woman remained grounded. She knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. While she appreciated the attention her story had brought to issues of racial bias, she understood that true progress required more than hashtags and viral videos. It required action. And so she decided to channel the momentum into something meaningful. In the days that followed, she partnered with civil rights organizations to launch a campaign aimed at addressing discrimination in the travel industry. Together, they pushed for greater transparency, accountability, and inclusivity within airlines and airports. She also used her platform to amplify voices that often went unheard, sharing stories from others who had faced similar injustices. Her goal was simple: to ensure that no one else would ever feel the way she had on that flight. Looking back on everything that had transpired, the woman couldn't help but marvel at how one moment of defiance had sparked such widespread change. Sure, it had been exhausting and emotionally draining at times, but it had also been empowering. She had proven to herself and to countless others that speaking up, even when it felt impossible, could lead to transformation. And as she stood there, surrounded by messages of gratitude and solidarity, she realized something important. This wasn't just her victory. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they didn't deserve a seat at the table, or in first class. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. The woman sat there, her phone still recording, her jaw set firmly. She wasn't just fighting for her seat anymore. She was fighting for something bigger: respect, dignity, justice. Every second that ticked by felt heavier, like the weight of the situation was pressing down on everyone in the plane. The flight crew looked increasingly uneasy, glancing at each other as if trying to figure out how to defuse the bomb they'd unintentionally lit. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the head stewardess stepped forward again. Her face was flushed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Ma'am," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "we're doing everything we can to resolve this, but we need your cooperation." The woman raised an eyebrow. "My cooperation?" she repeated, her tone sharp but controlled. "You're asking me to cooperate by giving up something I rightfully paid for? That's not cooperation. That's surrender. And I'm not going to do it." Her words hung in the air, bold and unshakable. The man sitting beside her shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence fading into irritation. He leaned over to the nearest attendant and muttered something under his breath, clearly unhappy about the delay. Whatever he said didn't help. The attendants only looked more flustered. It was then that the woman decided to make a move. She pulled out her phone again. not to record this time, but to dial a number. As the call connected, she spoke calmly, though her voice carried a quiet authority. "Hey, Dad," she said, "I need your help." On the other end of the line, her father, a self-made billionaire who had built his empire from scratch, answered immediately. His deep, commanding voice came through the speaker, steady and reassuring. "What's wrong?" he asked, sensing the urgency in her tone. She explained the situation quickly, laying out the details without sugarcoating anything. She told him about the flight crew's request, the dismissive attitude of the man beside her, and the blatant unfairness of it. When she finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then her father's voice hardened, his usual calm replaced by steely determination. "This isn't just about you," he said firmly. "This is about every person who's been treated like they don't belong because of the color of their skin. Let me handle this." Without wasting another second, he ended the call and dialed the airline's CEO, a man he happened to know personally from past business dealings. The conversation that followed was brief, but intense. Her father didn't mince words. He demanded answers, accountability, and immediate action. By the time he hung up, the airline's leadership team was scrambling to contain the fallout. Back on the plane, the woman waited patiently, her phone still recording. She knew her father wouldn't let her down, he never did, but she also understood that this moment was bigger than both of them. It was about standing up against systemic injustice, about refusing to be pushed aside because of prejudice. She glanced around the cabin, taking in the faces of the passengers. Some were watching her with admiration, others with discomfort, and a few with outright hostility. But she didn't care. This wasn't about winning a popularity contest. It was about doing what was right. Minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. There has been an operational adjustment that requires us to make some changes before takeoff. We appreciate your patience." The announcement was vague, but it sent a ripple of curiosity through the cabin. Passengers exchanged confused glances, whispering among themselves. What kind of operational adjustment could cause such a holdup? Before anyone could speculate further, the door to the cockpit opened and a new group of flight attendants entered the plane. They moved swiftly, replacing the original crew with practiced efficiency. The head stewardess, who had been pleading with the woman moments earlier, looked shell-shocked. She gathered her things quietly, avoiding eye contact with anyone as she exited the plane. The rest of the crew followed suit, their expressions a mix of embarrassment and relief. Within minutes, the entire team had been swapped out, leaving behind a fresh group of attendants who seemed eager to avoid any further drama. As the new head stewardess approached the woman, she offered a sincere apology. "Ma'am, we are so sorry for what happened. Please know that we value you as a customer and will do everything we can to ensure the remainder of your flight is comfortable." The woman nodded, accepting the apology, but not letting her guard down completely. She knew apologies were easy. It was actions that truly mattered. Still, she appreciated the gesture and decided to give the new crew a chance to prove themselves. Meanwhile, the man who had caused the whole fiasco was escorted off the plane. He protested loudly, claiming he was being treated unfairly, but his complaints fell on deaf ears. The attendants ignored him, focusing instead on getting the flight ready for departure. As he disappeared down the jet bridge, several passengers clapped softly, showing their approval of how the situation had been handled. Once the commotion died down, the woman settled back into her seat, exhaling deeply for the first time since the ordeal began. She glanced at her phone where the video she'd recorded was still saved. She knew she had captured something powerful, not just for herself, but for anyone else who had ever felt marginalized or dismissed. This wasn't just her story. It was a story for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. As the plane finally taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky, the woman allowed herself a small smile. She hadn't backed down. She hadn't given in. And thanks to one phone call to her father, justice had been served, at least for now. But she also knew this was just the beginning. The fight for equality and respect wasn't over. It might never be. But for today, she had won. And that was enough. The woman sat there, gripping the armrests of her seat, her mind racing. She knew she had every right to stay where she was. This was her seat, paid for fair and square. But the pressure around her was mounting. The flight crew hovered nearby, their body language tense, like they were waiting for her to crumble under the weight of their request. And then there was the man sitting next to her, fidgeting impatiently, his expensive watch gleaming as he checked it over and over again. "Ma'am," the attendant said again, her voice tinged with frustration now. "We really need you to cooperate. We can offer you a nice seat in economy, maybe even extra legroom, and we'll throw in some free drinks too." The woman raised an eyebrow at that. Free drinks? Extra legroom? It sounded more like they were trying to bribe her than solve the problem. She leaned back slightly, her posture calm but firm. "I don't want free drinks," she replied evenly. "And I definitely don't want extra legroom. What I want is for you to explain why I'm being asked to give up my seat when I followed all the rules." The attendant hesitated, glancing toward the front of the plane, where the senior crew members stood whispering among themselves. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the head stewardess stepped forward, attempting to smooth things over. She smiled tightly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "We understand your concern, ma'am, but sometimes these situations arise unexpectedly. If you could just move to another seat temporarily, we'd be happy to make sure you're comfortable." "Temporarily," the woman repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut through the tension in the cabin. "This isn't about temporary or permanent. This is about fairness. I paid for this seat, I earned it. Why should I have to justify my presence here while someone else gets to walk in and take what's mine without question?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. A few passengers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some nodded subtly, agreeing with her point, while others looked away, unwilling to get involved. One man sitting across the aisle cleared his throat and muttered, "She's got a point." But he didn't say it loudly enough for anyone official to hear. Meanwhile, the man who had taken the neighboring seat let out an exaggerated sigh. "Look," he said, turning to the flight crew, "can we please sort this out? I've got places to be, and I shouldn't have to deal with this kind of drama." The audacity of his comment made the woman's blood boil. Drama. Was that what he thought this was? As if her refusal to surrender her rights was causing unnecessary trouble? She turned to him slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time since he'd arrived. "Excuse me," she said, her tone icy but controlled. "But I didn't create this situation. You walked onto this plane assuming you could override someone else's reservation because you think you deserve special treatment. That's not how this works." He blinked, caught off guard by her directness, but quickly recovered. "Well, obviously something went wrong here," he shot back, gesturing vaguely toward the crew. "But arguing about it won't fix anything." "No," she agreed, leaning closer so he couldn't ignore her. "What will fix it is respecting the fact that this is my seat, not yours. Mine." For a split second, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Even the flight attendants froze, unsure of how to proceed. The tension was palpable, thick enough to touch. And yet, despite the pressure building around her, the woman felt strangely empowered. This wasn't just about keeping her seat anymore. It was about standing up for herself in a world that often tried to tell her she didn't belong. Seeing that the situation wasn't resolving itself, the head stewardess decided to try a different approach. She crouched down beside the woman, lowering her voice. "Listen, we value your business truly. If you'd be willing to relocate, we'd love to offer you a travel voucher, as a gesture of goodwill." "A voucher?" The woman echoed, incredulous. "You're offering me a voucher after asking me to give up something I already paid for? Do you realize how insulting that sounds?" The stewardess winced, clearly realizing she'd made a misstep. Before she could respond, the woman continued, speaking louder this time so everyone could hear. "If you're going to treat your customers differently based on who they are, or what you assume about them, you might want to rethink your policies, because this isn't okay." Her words resonated throughout the cabin. A young couple seated a few rows back exchanged a look before giving her a thumbs up. An older gentleman near the window nodded approvingly, muttering, "Good for her." Even the children in the row ahead stopped playing with their toys long enough to sense the gravity of the moment. Still, not everyone was supportive. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Others whispered behind cupped hands, speculating about whether the woman was making too big a fuss. The divide in the room was clear: those who recognized the injustice and those who preferred to look the other way. As the standoff dragged on, the woman pulled out her phone. She opened the camera app and began recording the interaction, explaining calmly into the lens what was happening. "Hi, everyone," she said, addressing whoever might watch later. "I'm currently on a flight where I've been asked to leave. My first-class seat, even though I booked it months ago, so someone else can have it. Someone who happens to be white. This is unacceptable, and I wanted to document it in case anyone tries to deny it later." Her actions sent a ripple through the cabin. The flight crew exchanged panicked looks, whispering urgently among themselves. The man in the neighboring seat crossed his arms tighter, scowling at the phone as if daring it to capture his discomfort. Meanwhile, several passengers leaned forward slightly, curious to see what would happen next. By now, it was clear that this wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a test of character. Would the airline stand by its employees' decision to prioritize one passenger over another based on unspoken biases? Or would they do the right thing and acknowledge the harm they were causing? The woman glanced around the cabin, taking in the mix of reactions. She felt a pang of sadness for the people who chose silence over solidarity, but she also felt a surge of gratitude for those who supported her quietly. Most of all, she felt determined. Whatever happened next, she knew she wouldn't back down. Not today. The day started like any other for the woman at the center of this story. She was a single mom, juggling life as a hard-working professional and a dedicated parent to her 2 kids. Her name isn't important right now. What matters is that she had earned her place in the world through grit, determination, and years of hustle. That morning, she woke up early, got herself ready, and headed to the airport for a flight from New York to Los Angeles. It wasn't just any flight. It was a first-class ticket, paid for with miles she'd collected over countless work trips. As she walked through the terminal, pulling her carry-on behind her, there was a quiet sense of pride in her step. First class wasn't something she took for granted. It represented how far she'd come despite all the obstacles life had thrown her way. The VIP section of the plane was her reward for late nights, missed family dinners, and pushing past people who doubted her abilities because of the color of her skin. When she reached her seat, she settled in with a sigh of relief. The leather chair felt luxurious, the kind you sink into after a long week. She pulled out her phone to check emails and maybe catch up on some reading before takeoff. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. Just as the last passengers were boarding, an airline attendant approached her. At first, she thought they were bringing water or asking if she needed anything. But then the attendant hesitated, looking uncomfortable, and said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, but we need you to move to economy class. There's been a mix-up." A mix-up? The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She stared at the attendant, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked, keeping her voice calm even though her heart was racing. "I booked this seat months ago. This is my seat." The attendant shifted awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. "We understand, ma'am, but another passenger is expecting this seat. They're a valued customer, and we really need to accommodate them." Valued customer? The phrase lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Before she could respond, she noticed someone walking down the aisle. A white man in his late 40s, dressed in expensive clothes. He glanced at her briefly, his expression dismissive, almost annoyed, before sitting down in the seat beside hers, without saying a word. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place. This wasn't about a mix-up or a mistake. It was about race. About who belonged in first class and who didn't. And suddenly she felt small, invisible, like her presence in this space was being questioned simply because of the color of her skin. Her mind raced. Should she give in? Move to economy without a fight? No, that wasn't an option. She'd worked too hard to let someone push her around like this. Still, she couldn't shake the sinking feeling in her stomach. What would happen next? Would the crew side with her, or would they force her hand? Around her, the other passengers began to notice the tension. Some looked away, pretending not to see what was happening. Others whispered to each other, shaking their heads in disbelief. One older woman gave her a sympathetic smile, but no one stepped forward to help. The man in the seat beside her crossed his arms, clearly irritated by the delay. "Can we hurry this up?" he snapped at the attendant. "I don't have time for this nonsense." Nonsense, that's what he called it. Not injustice, not discrimination, just nonsense. The word stung, but it also fueled her resolve. She wasn't going anywhere, not without a fight. And so, as the clock ticked closer to takeoff, she made a decision. She wouldn't back down. Not today. Not ever. Little did she know, this moment would set off a chain reaction that would change everything for her, for the airline, and for countless others watching from afar.